everybody. Welcome to this, our latest event, where we're trying to make some sense of what's going on in the world of monetary policy. And this event is, as you can see, the European Institute, along with OMFIF, which is an acronym that I've been rehearsing to make sure I get it right. Official Monetary Financial Institutional Forum. I'll tell you a story about this, which is that the journalist Bill Keegan, very renowned observer journalist, once made a speech on behalf of the government. And he said, "You mustn't call this ridiculous name, it will never stick." But it has. How long did it take? 20 years? 15 years. So we're delighted to be working with on this. Now we have an intriguing session today because you're two wonderful guests. On my immediate left, you have Megan Greene, who is now, she's obviously been on the monetary policy for over a year. I thought it was just a few weeks ago that she started. Megan's someone I've known a long time, who's done all kinds of interesting things in the academic and financial worlds. So she is we get an excellent appointment to the Megan Monetary Policy Committee, and then we go through all the biology. Boris Vujčić, I first met when he was one of the negotiators of the Croatian entry into the European Union. On his third mandate as governor of the Croatian National Bank. I think we struggled to find two better people to talk to us about the challenges of inflation. A little bit of housekeeping. I have a presentation first by Boris, then by Megan. I'll maybe ask them one or two questions, but I want to leave as much of the time as possible for open discussion. Sometimes we have a hash. LCEI is the hashtag for those of you who are obsessed with Twitter. I think that so we can probably just start without much further ado. For me, you all know what the challenge of inflation is. Nobody knows really what the ideal solution to inflation is. So with that, Boris, may I invite you to give your intervention. Thank you.
I am.
This one is already.
So I have to stay close to. Okay, good. So thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And the topic is the future of inflation, which is a very ambitious one. I don't think I will answer the question on the future of inflation. It's more to attract the audience. But what I'll try to do is I'll try to talk a little bit about the past of the inflation and then about some things that might affect the future of inflation. The idea is to say a few things about the long-term trends in inflation and the interest rates, and then discuss what they call 5Ds: deglobalization, demographics, digitalization, decarbonization, climate change, and defense, and speculate how they might affect a medium to longer term trend of structural factors of the inflation. So long-term trends, if this is like from the beginning of 20th century, I could have went further back, and what you see is you have different periods. One, interestingly, the beginning of this graph shows you the time of the very low inflation, the same as the end, pre-pandemic times. And actually, if you go back to the beginning of 20th century, there was a lot of negative inflation at that time. Also, the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, US, for example, had a negative inflation. Nobody worried about the negative inflation then. It was not a spiraling negative inflation. It was just low, sometimes negative numbers, -1%, -2%. But it was also a time of a very high productivity growth. So people were associating very low stable prices with a high productivity growth. At the end of the period, there was not such a high productivity growth, at least not in the advanced economies. But there was a high productivity growth in the emerging markets. Other people would associate these developments with the stable anchor, like the gold standard. that existed at that time, or the period of post-Bretton Woods economy, where you had implicit gold standard through a dollar again, and the periods of the instability when you didn't have a real anchor. And the third way to look at it in a longer perspective is times of globalization versus the times of deglobalization. So end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, beginning of the globalization, lots of trade. Then the period between two wars, deglobalization, fragmentation for geopolitical reasons, obviously, wars. And then the 70s, when you didn't have, you had some open wars, but it was basically oil shock, which is also associated with the geopolitical risks. Now, zooming in a little bit into the decade before the pandemic, more than half of advanced economies have experienced the average inflation rate of below 2% in the decade preceding the pandemic, and the central banks were resorting to the unconventional monetary policy tools, trying to bring the inflation up to the target of 2%. But there was not as much negative inflation as at the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century. That was a difference. And the productivity growth in the advanced economy was low or declining. And productivity growth in the emerging, particularly China, as I'll show later, countries was high. Now, if you look at this period preceding the pandemic, there was a lot of similar underlying developments that affected the headline inflation, CPI. But there was also, it seems, quite a lot of idiosyncratic factors that impacted the core inflation, so primarily domestic inflation or services inflation, even in the period preceding the pandemic, that you can see on the right-hand slide, where you say, well, percent of variance of inflation, which is explained by the first principal component. So you have a PPI, CPI, so trade-related part, which is more common, and then you have a core, which is more like a wage services kind of a thing, where you could see more idiosyncratic factors in different countries. Now, along with the decrease of inflation, the structural factors that were affecting the inflation trends obviously also affected the R star. And here I present a number of studies, both on the US and the Eurozone, that were looking at the trend value of the R star. All studies were basically showing it's coming down. And that was also why central banks resorted to the unconventional monetary policy tools, facing the zero lower bound. But then, after the pandemic, things changed. So inflation surged, interest rates went up, which at the time when it was happening, going back to 21, 22, first opened the question of so-called transitory versus permanent inflation. Two camps of economists. Transitory, so we can look through, central banks don't have to react with interest rates. And the others who were saying, no, it's permanent, it will spill over into higher inflation for a longer period of time, so there should be a reaction. Permanent camp won, obviously. But now with the inflation coming down, again, it opened a new discussion. And again, you have two camps of economists. Some who say, okay, now we're going back to where we were pre-pandemic. And there's another camp. And I had today 3 different discussions with different economists who have very strong views. Those who say, no, we're not going back to the pre-pandemic. The world has changed and the inflation will look differently. And the R star is in a different place than it was here before the pandemic. So in order to look a little bit, try to look into the future of the inflation, I'm going to look at these 5 Ds and how they might have changed. First, globalization. I think there's no dispute that the globalization had a long-term disinflationary impact. And it happened through the different channels, increased trade integration, greater role of emerging market economies, primarily China, but also others, who experienced a long period of very high productivity growth and were introducing the low-cost goods and services, expansion of the global value chains, and finally the reduced bargaining power of workers, because there was a huge positive labor supply shock in 30 years, 40 years, say from 80 until 210, 220, where a massive amount of labor force became available to the Western companies. If we look at the trade openness, it increased to that period. And when you plot globalization index for the world and the inflation, see that they move in the opposite direction, and particularly since the 90s. We see more globalization, less of the inflation. Through all these channels, now we can discuss which channels are more important or less, but I think there's not much dispute that the globalization definitely helped central bankers. Some people would say, well, central banks were just lucky. It's not that they had to do much. It was like deglobalization that did much of the work for them. This is just what I was talking about. On the right-hand side, you see the difference in the productivity growth, particularly China, but also other low and middle income countries versus the euro area. And you can see that there's a long period of very high productivity growth in particularly China, and increasing share of the world exports going to these countries, which was putting the downward pressure on the price and inflation. These things have started to change to a large extent because of the geopolitics. And you have now more and more tariffs and other trade barriers, which people would agree have more inflationary effect directly through higher prices, but also due to lower supply. Higher energy prices, increased production costs, because it becomes less available to move production to lower income countries. Actually, you have onshoring, reshoring of the activities, and also increased labor costs. And increased labor costs to some extent because of this deglobalization fragmentation trend, but also because this huge excess pool of labor, which joined the world labor market since 1980, has been to a large extent exhausted, or the wages went up. For example, in China, wages went up a lot. And then, of course, there are some things which work in the opposite direction. Disinflationary, like reduced external demand for domestic products and services. I mean, you can think of, for example, American or European tariffs on Chinese goods, leaving the excess capacity in China, putting a downward pressure on prices there. So fragmentation, in a way, can have both inflationary and disinflationary effects, but most of the people would think more inflationary than disinflation. Fragmentation actually only adds up to a long-term trend of increasing the number of non-tariff barriers. So these are not tariffs, these are usually technical or health standards, which, as you can see, have been increasing now for a long period of time. And then this is a nice graph which shows world production of selected commodities like rare earths or oil or things like that, and you see more and more use of voluntary export restrictions as a part of the trade war for geopolitical reasons, mostly. This is something we have not seen so much in the last decades, but now it becomes again quite popular. So just say, okay, I'm not gonna put a tariff on your products. I'm just not gonna export some products to you. I limit the possibility of export of some critical, for example, raw material or chips, as you know, or some high-end products that are not made in other countries. Second D is a demography, which I also think there's not much dispute that the demography also has a strong impact on the long-term inflation trend on the NDR star. But there you have, again, two camps of economics who look at the demography in a different way. One camp that says increasing the share of the dependent population, dependency ratio, lowers the savings rate, and therefore drives up the natural rate, which has, in other words, inflationary effect. Then you have other economists who will tell you that increasing longevity, if you have economic agents with the perfect foresight, actually increases the savings rate because you know you're going to live longer. So you're going to save more today, which increases the saving rate and works disinflationary. And then there are people who will tell you that decrease in the effective labor population ratio basically boils down to the slowdown in the TFP for output PC growth, per capita growth, which then lowers the demand for capital, lower marginal product of capital, and so the R star goes down. Again, a disinflation.
Might be just worth saying one sentence about the meaning of R star for those who are not familiar with it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I can now talk 5 minutes at least about it.
That's why I said the sentence.
But it's basically some natural or neutral, and there is a difference between the two, interest rate, long-run interest rate, which is a holy grail for the central bankers. We all try to figure out where it is. In the end, I will tell you where it is. But for now, let me just leave it there. It's going to be more interesting. And then there's a political economy channel. As population grows older, they might prefer different levels of inflation. For example, inflation is particularly unpopular with the older population because they have their savings. Worth of their saving goes down with the inflation. But if you're a borrower, younger like you may prefer higher inflation because there's an inflationary impact on your possibly credits that you will take in order to finance house purchases, car purchases, whatever you want to have. And that can also have impact on the politics and on the political, I would say, the appetite for a higher or lower inflation. Now, I personally think that the most important thing really which happened was that this huge positive labor supply shock of which I was speaking before is now for sure gone, and it's gone for good. Between 1980, 2010, there was estimated 1.3 billion new workers who joined the labor market in a way that it could be used by the Western companies. It's mainly China, but also other developing countries who joined. Also the Central East Europe, where I come from, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it's gone, and it will not repeat itself ever. From now on, the working age population will come down, and this disinflationary impact of positive labor supply shock is gone already or will diminish depending on where we talk about. The question is whether Africa, which is the only continent where we'll see strong growth in population, will be able to repeat the experience of, let's say, China or Central East Europe, bringing their labor force into productive uses for let's say, Western or now Eastern companies, Chinese companies. China is investing a lot in it. So the dependency ratio is now clearly on the way up. Third thing, digitalization. Many people put a lot of faith in the AI, and digitalization, I think, clearly works disinflationary. It has worked disinflationary up until now through three channels: direct, through the cheaper ICT products for consumers, and also through the increase in the productivity, automation, but also through the indirect channel, which is the increased competition, lower price markups due to better abilities of the arbitrage, more information, faster information, and that has all put a downward pressure on the price. I'm going to skip the details about it, but there are estimates of, for example, the first directional, how much lower price of ICT goods and services contributed more in the past than in the recent 10 years, but still negatively contributing to the inflation, or the indirect channel, which you can measure in different ways: the share of e-commerce and total retail, asking the companies on the impact of the digitalization on labor productivity in the companies. So estimates differ, but the direction is always the same. Now, there's a lot of faith in AI, that it can replicate, for example, what internet and the first wave of digitalization did for the productivity. However, that we still need to see in the future. There has been a lot of money now invested into AI, but there's a disconnect really in the market in terms of how much money is invested at the moment in the AI and how much companies can monetize that are producing AI, how much revenue they receive from the corporates, much less than is being invested, on the hope that it will be able to monetize it all. But let's see, some of it certainly will be monetized, and the AI will increase the productivity. It's very difficult to say at the moment how. But there are then also some other aspects. One, for example, is that digitalization has enabled the development of personalized pricing models. In trade, you learned about the pricing to market behavior of companies. Now, digitalization has actually enabled you not to price to market, but to price to person, PTP, to individual, which gives more pricing power to the companies, so they can charge more, which lifts up the inflation. But overall, I would say this works inflationary, but overall digitalization, I think, undoubtedly works disinflation. Fourth thing, decarbonization or climate change overall, which also has already and will have impact on the inflation. Schnabel lists three different channels through which it can work. First one is so-called climate inflation. That's not natural disasters, unfavorable weather conditions, extreme weather conditions. And we have the statistics which shows that the incidence of the extreme weather conditions is increasing statistically significantly. And that also affects the prices as a consequence of the physical risk of a climate change. Then there's a green inflation, transition to the green technologies, which is also likely to lead to increase in the demand for certain commodities whose supply is limited. For example, to open a new mine, it takes 5 to 10 years. So at least in, let's say, short to medium run, this increases in the demand for commodities that are necessary in the green transition technologies might lead to a higher prices. And then fossil inflation, which is this real decarbonization price, where you actually tax fossil fuel one way or the other, which again increases the price of the fossil fuels. And finally, and most recently, defense. Since 2022, Russian aggression on Ukraine as you can see, this is Europe. It's not the world. This is Europe. NATO goal of 2% defense spending. Europe was consistently below 2%. You've heard about the Trump argument, pay more for defense. But now, after the Russian invasion, for the first time, Europe is over 2%. With large variability, because you see some countries are spending 4%, some are still below 2%, 1.2, 1.3. Usually, there's a geography of defense spending. Further away you are from Russia, places, closer you are, more eastern. But I think it's a clear trend upwards. You'll see further increase in the defense spending in future years, which can again put additional inflationary pressure through the higher energy prices needed to produce or use military equipment, higher commodities prices used there, or because of the fiscal expansion that will be needed to support higher defense spending in Europe. So there are, I'm not going to go through this. There are lots of structural factors that will affect inflation in the medium to long run, disinflationary or inflationary, both on goods prices or on services prices. How they will play out, which will dominate, is difficult to say. Some of them are, I didn't even mention. For example, if you think about the services versus goods, because during the COVID, there was a orientation toward the consumption of the goods away from services, and then the rotation back toward the services. But it seems now this rotation is going further from where we were in pre-pandemic times, and that we might be observing a permanent shift in the consumer preferences towards the services rather than goods. Why? Among other things, because younger generations prefer experience, services rather than goods. I have 3 kids. All are now over 18 years old. When I became 18 years old, there were 2 things I wanted in life: car and a good hi-fi. My kids don't want to have car. Only one owns a car. Others are using Uber, Bolt, whatever service. So they have moved to services from the goods. So 23 car sales in the world are 40 million. 2019, there were 60 million. So there is a 1/3 drop in the demand for cars. That also, in terms of the relative prices, and because the services inflation has been historically always higher than the goods inflation, might affect the inflation trends. Disinflationary for goods, inflationary for services. And the services are larger and larger chunk of the overall. So there are many things, and therefore I don't have an answer on the future of inflation or where the R-star is. But there are a few things that I think we can repeat that I would say, relearn maybe from the recent inflation episode and from the fact that the central banks, after a long period of time, had to hike interest rates so high and so rapidly. One is that even if inflation falls asleep, it's never dead. Or to quote Rudiger Dornbusch, who said before he died, that the beast is asleep but not slain. And recent inflation reminds us of that, but it also reminds us of how unpopular inflation is. If you think of politicians who have lost elections or are about to lose elections in last couple of years, much of it was because of the high inflation and the dislike of the voters, particularly older voters, for the inflation. And that's good news for the central banks, because then in the end, they still need us to keep the inflation in check. For quite a long period of time, some people were saying, well, I mean, independent central banks, do we really still need them? Inflation is gone anyway. And it's going to all continue to come down. And the fact that the central banks are independent has helped us to face relatively low sacrifice ratio in bringing down the inflation this time around. Why? Because the inflation expectations were well linked. So that's another message. And I think like the low inflation, the central bank independence should be never taken for granted. We should always remind public that it is important and it should remain there because it really helps us to fight inflation. The magnitude of the challenges in the future, because of all these factors, might be greater than before. So we might see potentially higher and or more volatile inflation because of all these structural factors. And that's why preserving central bank independence is even more important, which is a good way for central bank.
Boris. As usual, I've known Boris a long time, an excellent, clear, lucid presentation. And I hope you will start bringing up your questions for when we come to questions and answers later. But first, let's hear from someone who has a different challenge within the monetary policy committee of the Bank of England, Megan.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm gonna go through the rest of your slides. There we go. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I used to work across the street in Red Lion Square, so I cut through this campus every day, but a lot has changed since then, including this building, which is brand new to me. I'm gonna focus more on the kind of medium-term conjecture for inflation as opposed to taking a longer-term perspective. I will say, however, though, if you're looking for a vision on what the long-term challenges in inflation are, it's worth reading Claudio Borio's piece that he wrote for UMFIF. Actually, he's retiring from the BIS and wrote a really good piece for UMFIF about that. But like I said, I'm going to focus on the UK mainly, and I'm going to focus on the medium term for the Bank of England. Our outlook period is 2-3 years. So that's where I'm going to focus my views. In the UK, we've had these waves of inflation that not actually everyone shared in the same way. You can see this is just a decomposition of headline inflation over the past couple of years. And we had a wave of goods inflation, then energy inflation really took off. And you can see towards now, it's mostly yellow bars, that's services inflation that's driving inflation higher. Boris mentioned that we tend to be services-driven economies in the developed world. So these percentages are just the weight in our inflation basket. You can see services account for about half of the UK's inflation basket. So we've had these different waves. I actually had a French economist ask me this weekend why UK inflation was so much higher than the rest of the developed worlds. And the very short answer is that the UK got the double whammy of a kind of demand shock with fiscal stimulus as a response to COVID, like the US, smaller, but like the US, along with the terms of trade shock from the Russian invasion of Ukraine with energy and food prices jumping. In fact, energy prices rose more in the UK than they did in the Eurozone, actually. So it makes you ask questions about the pricing of our energy. But in any case, we got this real double whammy. We've seen, thankfully, that inflation's come down. We've been close to our target for a couple of months now in the UK, and that's really good news. But if you split up goods and services inflation, you can see that core goods inflation, which is the orange line, came down actually below sort of historic norms and is now roughly at historic norms. That's around 1% inflation, whereas services inflation is still well above historic norms. So often if you think of an average inflation of 2%, that tends to involve goods at core goods at 1%, services inflation at 3%, that averages out to 2%. But as you can see, services inflation is well above historic norms. UK services inflation is also elevated relative to other developed economies. So this is just looking at inflation over the past couple of years since before the pandemic in the Eurozone, the US, and the UK. And services inflation, you can see that's the line. It's much higher in the UK than it has been in the US and the Eurozone. It's come down in all three jurisdictions, certainly, and it's clearly on a downward path in the UK as well. This is a decomposition of services inflation. So we look at what the drivers are, and you can see the biggest driver for the Eurozone, the US and the UK is the orange bars. That's pay growth. You can see that's much higher in the UK than it is across other developed economies. So pay growth is really buoying inflation. This is looking at a bunch of different metrics. I'm trying to gauge underlying services inflation, so core services inflation in the UK, because we don't have an official metric for core services inflation. So we look at a few different ones, and this is just looking at a few different ones in year-on-year terms. Headline services inflation is the aqua bar. You can see it's coming down. In fact, all of them are coming down. So this is really good news. Services inflation is coming down. It just remains elevated to where we'd like it to be, certainly, and to historic norms. The one that isn't really coming down as quickly as the rest is non-energy intensive services. So we stripped out all energy intensive services to see how much heavy lifting energy has been doing. And it seems like energy has been doing quite a lot of heavy lifting. So inflation for non-energy intensive services is kind of flattened out. But generally, they're all on a downward trend. And because I anticipate someone's going to ask me about the budget, I thought I'd just knock it on the head and say that we do think that the budget will have some implications for inflation in the UK. It'll probably raise inflation by just under 0.5 percentage point at the peak, which is 1 year out before coming down. So this is just looking at a decomposition and actually a big impact that most people don't realize on inflation is the fuel duty, which we always assume will come off, but never actually does. So because we condition our forecasts on announced government policy, you can see that that's pushing up inflation as well. When we ask firms what they think will happen to services price inflation going forward a year ahead, you can see that that's the diamonds. You can see that they expect services inflation to come down as well. So that's good news, to continue to come down, but it kind of stalls out at around 4%, which is higher than the 3% average norm. So, you know, even firms, when asked what they expect for services inflation a year ahead in our DMP or decision makers panel survey, think inflation will be higher a year ahead. So services inflation is coming down, but it's not coming down as quickly as I would like. And so we try to figure out exactly why that is. And as I mentioned, pay growth is the biggest contributor to services inflation. So looking at the labor market, we try to gauge tightness in the labor market. And the best way to do that is to kind of look at vacancies to unemployment. This is just a chart showing that ratio, and you can see it's been coming down at a slightly lower pace this year than it was last year, but the labor market continues to ease. That's the takeaway notion. So that's good luck. That suggests that pay growth should come off, and with it, services inflation. Another input into wage growth is inflation expectations, and this is just two charts looking at inflation expectations for households and also for businesses. For businesses, short-term and medium-term expectations have come down roughly in line with historic norms. For households, they've come down as well. In the past couple of readings, they ticked up a little bit, but they're roughly in line with historic norms. So that shows that, you know, inflation expectations remain anchored, have been anchored for a while, actually. So if inflation expectations are anchored, as people are going out to negotiate for wages, they expect inflation to be, you know, around historical levels going forward. And so they might demand smaller wage increases on that basis. So that should take some pressure off of wage growth as well. This is just looking at wage growth, it's private sector, regular pay growth, showing a decomposition. So what are the drivers of that? And you can see indeed inflation expectations are the biggest drivers. So if inflation expectations are roughly in line with historic averages, that suggests that actually wage growth should start to come down as well. Looking at wage growth, sure enough, it has been coming down, but like services inflation, it hasn't been coming down as quickly as I would like to see. We have an indicator-based model at the Bank of England. That's the chart on the left, just taking a bunch of different series that we find and looking at their historical relevance to wage growth. And you can see that has shown that, you know, private sector regular pay should continue to come down going forward. And then we also look at a host of different series for wage growth. Private sector regular pay is one we have tended to focus on, but we also looked at the Indeed wage tracker, some tax data as well. And all of these show wage growth coming down as well. That said, wage growth is higher than what we would like to see for an inflation target of 2%. So generally, if you consider productivity growth of roughly 1%, inflation of 2%, wage growth well over 3% is still too high. When it comes to forecasting wage growth, we've actually seen wage growth come in higher than all of our wage models have been able to explain for a while now, and we expect it to continue to until about the middle of next year. So that provides some upside risk to wage growth because our models can't explain why wage growth has been so high. It suggests that it might continue to be outside of the sway that our wage models predict. Like I said, we expect it to come back in line with our models next year, but there is some upside risk there. And there's also some upside risk in what firms are telling us. So again, we ask in our decision maker panel survey, we ask firms what they expect for wage growth a year ahead. And you can see that this is just splitting it up between goods and consumer facing services. You can see that wage growth for consumer facing services should be, just under 5% a year ahead. For goods, just under 4% a year ahead. That averages out to around 4%. What worries me is that you can see, if you look at the diamonds, that they were coming down, but they've flattened out for the past couple of months. So that suggests that there's some risk that wage growth might be stickier than we would hope as well. And consequently, services inflation and overall inflation might be too. Just a point on all of our forecasts, they're always conditioned on a market curve. And so I just wanted to highlight a complication with that. This is looking at short rates in the UK and what has really been driving them since our last monetary policy report in August. You can see that the aqua bars are UK events driving moves in the curve. The purple ones are Eurozone data and the orange is US. About half of the moves in our curve have tended to be driven by things happening outside of the UK. So as it happens when you're a small open economy, you end up being influenced by what's happening elsewhere in the world. And of course, that influences our forecasts as well. Historically speaking, about a third of the moves in our curve in the UK were influenced by things happening outside the UK. Now it's about half, so it's higher than what we've become accustomed to. And so that poses a risk as well, particularly given geopolitical events and given possible economic policies coming from across the ocean with a new president-elect. So, at the end of the day, one sell-side research pointed out we're all tied to the drunken dragon of the US Treasury curve. And that's certainly true for a small open economy like the UK. So how do we formulate monetary policy in a world that involves so much uncertainty? I thought I'd just take a few minutes to kind of lay out how the MPC's been thinking about it. We've kind of considered, given the successive shocks that we've had, supply shocks in particular over the past couple of years, there are sort of three states of the world that seem possible. One we refer to as case one. And as Boris said, it's kind of the view among economists that everything's just going back to what it was like before, effectively. So a lot of these shocks were externally driven. As those external shocks fade, actually inflation comes down towards the target without the Bank of England or monetary policy having to do much more heavy lifting. So that's a relatively benign state of the world. There's another state of the world, which we call case two, which suggests that actually there's more inflation persistence off the back of these successive shocks. And so actually monetary policy has to do some work in order to bring inflation to our target over the medium term, so over the next 2 to 3 years. And that will involve a trade-off between output and price stability. The third state of the world is a trickier one. It just involves structural shifts like R-star, for example, that Boris was talking about, where price and wage setting have kind of fundamentally changed over the course of the past couple of years. So R-star might have moved, the natural rate of unemployment might have shifted up, long run potential growth might have shifted down. And all those things would require monetary policy to be restrictive for longer. So those are sort of the three scenarios that we're thinking about the world through. Different MPC members place different probabilities and risks on these different cases. I would say that there's a probability greater than zero for all three of these states of the world. I would also say that they're not mutually exclusive. So it's possible that some inflation has just come off because the external shocks have faded, while some inflation is a bit more persistent. And there may have also been some structural shifts in the economy. So we're trying to set monetary policy in this very uncertain environment by thinking about kind of the different states of the world and what we think is the most likely. I've laid out 3 states of the world. Unfortunately, there are many more states of the world that we could possibly think about, and we certainly do. And so just in conclusion, I thought I might highlight a few of the other risks that we're facing. One is in the labor market, and that's a more immediate risk, in my view, in the UK, partly off the back of recent policies. So the increase in the NICs, or the national insurance contributions, alongside a higher than expected national living wage and some employment regulations, all generally increase the cost of employment for companies. So there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly how they'll react to that. They might go ahead and push higher costs through to end users, so that would involve higher prices. But a lot of firms have been telling us they don't feel like they have pricing power. So firms could also respond to this by reducing employment, or they could just reduce hours worked. They might invest in capital instead of labor, so you might have an increase in productivity. Or they might just simply let it eat into their margins. There's a lot of uncertainty around this, so that's something that we're certainly looking for evidence of which path firms will take, because that will have real implications for growth and also for inflation. Trade fragmentation clearly is a big risk going forward, and that isn't just tariffs, but generally fragmentation. I think the IMF just came out with a report recently that showed that the long run implications of fragmentation is to shave off 7% of global GDP. That's roughly the size of Germany and France's economy combined. So, that's the upper band of the window that they had forecast, but that's nothing to sniff at. And then finally, the green transition looms large as well. So that will have implications for our star, as Boris went through, also for inflation and growth. I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks to the discipline of our speakers, we have ample time for a discussion. If you allow me, I'll start with a couple of questions so that the rest of you can think about the insightful, decisive question you want to try to get answered. If I start, pose the question to both of you. We hear from Boris, quoting Willie Dornbush, that the beast is not slain, the beast of inflation. But a political economy question, which I think is relevant in this context, is whether it will still be the headline item in economic discourse over the next couple of years, or has the fact that it's turned the corner, seems to be creeping downwards, seems as though the monetary policy specialists have managed to curb inflation again, having maybe missed it rising in the first place, is inflation going to slip off the agenda?
Again,
Lean forward a bit, so.
if I can briefly comment on it, I think it will not, for a simple reason that even if we manage to bring it down to our medium-term goal, 2%, where people should not worry about it, and we should not worry about it, I think it will stay on the agenda because people perceive inflation differently. They always think in terms of the cumulative inflation. I am without historical, and I cannot think of the inflation the way we actually target it. I have no idea what the prices of particular goods were in November last year. I remember where they were before the inflation started to creep up in 2021, and that's how people think about it, and that's why the inflation will stay a topic. In politics, in the media, people have saw prices rising more than they probably have seen through many of them through their life. They haven't seen such a high inflation. And because they think, because the perception is always in terms of cumulative inflation, it will stay the topic, even if we reach 10%, it is going to get down to the medium-term targets.
Megan, do you agree or disagree?
Yeah. I agree, and not just because we have to justify our jobs. I think inflation will continue to be an issue. There's a lot of research, looking into why would we have a 2% inflation target in most of the developed world, and the research suggests that actually it just needs to be below 4%. If it's 4% or above, people really notice it, and if it's under 4%, people don't really care. And I think in normal times that might be right, but to Boris's point, the cumulative increase of prices over the past 5 years has been enormous. And in the UK, you're seeing that played out in consumption and consumers not really spending, even though real incomes have been rising, confidence has been improving. The savings rate is roughly 10% in the UK. And so I think people will continue to be sensitive to inflation going forward. Also, inflation's a regressive tax effectively, and there have been distributional implications of the past couple of years. They've been different in different countries, but there certainly are some who feel left behind. And so inflation will continue to bite more for them than it will for others.
The second question I have is about monetary policy strategy. It struck me that it's now 27 years since Gordon Brown produced his bombshell in the UK of saying we're now going to have an independent central bank, and the target will be 2% for consumer price inflation plus or minus 1 percentage point. In the ECB, European Central Bank, it was always a bit more vague. It was 2% or somewhere close to 2%. There's never quite a target until the monetary policy strategy review of 2021. And in that review of 2021, there was a promise to look at it again by 2026. Who's got it right? Megan.
So the ECB and the US are doing monetary policy strategy reviews. There is a question about whether there is symmetry in the inflation target. So that's something that the ECB did adopt. Didn't have it before. The Fed's kind of fudged it, so it's an average inflation target, but you don't actually quite know what time period that's over. I think what people forget these days, because we've all been fighting to get inflation down, is that for years and years and years, we couldn't actually get inflation up to our target. So I think now it's quite easy to say that central banks have asymmetric attitudes towards inflation. I actually don't think that's true, particularly given the experience for the pandemic, where inflation was persistently below our target.
Boris?
I think we don't have a full, we have this mid-strategy review. And I think it was clear that the target will not be, it's not on the agenda. We're not going to talk about that. We have the symmetric around it, and this will stay. So it's more that in this strategy review, we'll try to take the stock of what have we learned over the past few years implementing the monetary policy. What do we learn from the discussion between the permanent versus transitory, when we should look through, when not. As Megan has said, we deployed huge artillery to try to bring the inflation up to 2%. We did reporting take out of that. And then now we are in the process of the exit, quantitative tightening. At the beginning, people said, well, this is uncharted territory, we don't know how it's going to look like. Now we know much more. So that's also a topic for a strategy review, because you learn something over the time, but not the goal, at least for the ECB.
Right, last question from me. both of you in roundabout ways mentioned productivity. There's a famous aphorism which I think is attributed to Paul Krugman of productivity isn't everything, but it's just about everything. We know that productivity has fallen over recent years. Is there a magic bullet that could be fired to try to get productivity back on track? Or is it a consequence of things like the demographic change, the inability to deploy these various innovations in information and AI technologies, or some other phenomenon that we can deal with? Because in the absence of productivity, you're not going to get rapid economic growth. And if you don't get rapid economic growth, inflation risks are going to be higher.
Oh, productivity, for example, in our case, this is like one of the key things in our narrative. Productivity growth will help us. In the
Are we in Croatia or?
No, I'm talking about Eurozone. Well, in Croatia, there is a productivity growth. We're growing 3.7%. Employment is growing 2% per year. Productivity also is for a worker. But then also the question is how do you measure productivity? We can measure it in different ways, and it's not. This is one of the things which is imprecisely measured. They don't have one measure. Whether you measure it per hour work, person work, the number of hours worked came down. So the productivity per hour work is higher than productivity per worker. However, I agree with you. The long-term trend is a slowdown in the productivity growth in most advanced countries, and that's again productivity is the key thing, both for the standard of living and for us as central bankers. You don't get any productivity growth in the future that will make our job more difficult. As I said in the beginning, end of 20th century, end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, negative inflation. Nobody cared. It's good thing, negative inflation, because we have very high productivity growth. Very high productivity growth. If there's no productivity growth, and you have for example, deflation, negative inflation, it's a very different situation.
Yeah, so productivity growth heals all economic wounds. It boosts potential growth, and so kind of helps set the speed limit for the economy, above which you get inflationary impulses. And productivity growth has been low in the UK. It's dropped actually pretty significantly since before the global financial crisis. And if you try to figure out what's going on there, a piece of it is investment, which has also flattened out since before the global financial crisis. And so, what can you do to boost productivity growth? Well, investment would certainly help. So, along those lines, AI is the latest, greatest. Is that going to save us is the question. It has the potential to, it could become a general purpose technology that gets adopted and is widespread. General purpose technologies tend to take a really long time to feed through into the productivity data. So I think the personal computer took about 20 years to actually show up in productivity data. It took people a while to adopt it, figure out how to use it productively. It's hard to afford. That's different for AI, so it's mostly free. But anyhow, so it has the potential to be transformative. Does it have the potential to be transformative over the horizon that central bankers are looking at, which is kind of 2 to 3 years out? My guess is probably not. We're going to have to wait quite a lot longer for that, unfortunately. One thing I will say about productivity growth as well, on this point on fragmentation, there is a bunch of research showing that if you have more fragmentation, that tends to hit productivity growth because you have less competitiveness and less kind of knowledge sharing. So, there's a supply side effect from fragmentation as well that we should be cognizant of.
Okay, thanks. Now I'll open it to the audience and I'll take questions in groups of 3. Please see plenty of hands. Please wait for the microphone. And also we have an online audience, and Laura sitting here will tell me if there is an online question. So I'll start with you. Where you work for one of these. Straight ahead.
Hello, and thank you very much for your presentation. It was amazing, both of the presentations.
Very briefly, just say your name and the affiliation.
Okay, my name is Darina Trinduk, and I'm just an alumni of LSE, graduating this year, actually. You have mentioned that CPI have been declining and now is very close to target. You have also mentioned that UK economy is dependent on various factors, especially outside of the UK. And taking into account how much ECB and Fed's been cutting rates recently, do you not think that Bank of England is missing out and not cutting enough and maybe missing out on an opportunity for further growth?
Okay. Who was next? Here in the front. Sorry, just behind there. And then come to the front here.
Hi, Boris. Hi, Megan. Thank you for the speech. It's very interesting. I wanted to ask Boris specifically. So my name is Remo. I'm an alumni from LSE, graduated last year. I wanted to ask, how are you thinking about the divergence in Europe with core versus non-core? And secondly, some of the members in the governing council at the ECB are flagging potential risks to missing the target from below. How do you square those together with, I guess, risk to downside for German growth, for example?
Straightforward here, please.
Thanks very much. Theo Morris Clark from Rokos Capital. So I was really interested in what, Megan, what you said at the end about the labour market and the budget's potential impact on that. So just thinking conceptually for a second, if an increase in employment rights, higher minimum wage, and higher, national insurance, i.e., some kind of payroll tax, if all of that leads to lower labour demand and a rise in the unemployment rate, is that a pure loosening of the labour market, or is that also the Naira increasing? And how should the Bank of England sort of think about that?
Three provocative questions. Megan, at least one and a half are directed at you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so is the Bank of England behind the curve? Is effectively, I think, what you asked. So if you think that we live in a case one state of the world, absolutely, and all the risk is on the downside, actually, then you might make that argument that policy doesn't need to be as restrictive as it is. I happen to think, and you'll know this from my voting record, that actually the risks of the third case outweigh the risks of the first case. So, I put a lot of weight on the second case, which just means that we need to have an output gap open up to bring inflation to target. So, why do I put more weight on the third case? I think there is a risk that I'll combine these questions a little bit, that the natural rate of employment has ticked up. The MPC has revised up our estimate for that over the past year already, but I think there's a risk that it might need to be a bit higher. I also think for a number of reasons that Boris already outlined that our star has gone up as well. If you want details on that, I gave my first speech on that about a year ago. So that suggests there have been some structural shifts, which would require more restrictive policy for longer. I guess it's also a question of whether you think it's a question of risk management as well. So do you think it's worse to do too much or too little? Given the bout of inflation that we've just had, I think the risk of doing too little, cutting too early or too aggressively is a greater risk than going a bit more slowly. So no is the short answer. And then on the labor market loosening, so if the NICs and the national living wage and the employment regulations suggest that there's a shakeout in the labor markets, so I do think that would be loosening of the labor market as well. Whether it also represents an increase in the NAIRU or the natural rate of employment, I think it's possible. If this is a permanent thing, then it would suggest it might be, but we very much aren't quite sure how firms are going to respond to this, but it's certainly a consideration.
For anyone not familiar with it, NIRU is an acronym meaning the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. The theory behind it, or at least the concept behind it, theory is a bit strong, is that if unemployment is above that rate, inflation comes down, and if it's below it, inflation goes up. So if the NIRU rate itself goes up, getting inflation down becomes harder. I'm conscious that not
Yeah,
everybody
yeah,
knows
no,
these things. Boris.
I understood two-thirds of the question. I'm not sure whether I understood the first one. When you say core versus non-core, you mean countries or inflation?
Yeah, countries, so Germany and France.
Well, it's something that I want to comment on. What we always do in the ECB is we look at one inflation number, and that's the Eurozone. We don't look, and this is actually true in our discussions. If you're there at the governing council, we don't go and say inflation in this country, in that country. We look at one number: employment, unemployment, GDP growth, PMIs are sometimes discussed across the country in different times, but we always focus on a single inflation number. And then when people say that we might undershoot the target, of course, there's always a risk of undershooting the target. And by definition, I would say, by construction, as we move towards the target, the risk of undershooting the target decreases. When you're at the target, it should be symmetrical. In the end, there should be a symmetrical risk of overshooting or undershooting. So that's not something that is unexpected, and we know why people say so. Of course, some people always emphasize more one risk or the other risk. People see risks differently. That's why you have many people sitting in the room. But certainly the risk of undershooting has now increased compared to 6 months ago, let's say. Many problems. Well, that's a different thing. One has to ask whether the monetary policy can help, say, Germany economic problems. If you want to answer that question, you have to look at what part of it is cyclical and what part of it is structural. Cyclical was monetary policy can address. So as we ease interest rates, for example, likely construction sector in Germany will pick up faster. If you think about the Volkswagen, when we ease rates, they would still probably have to close 2 factories as they planned this, because as they said before, if demand has dropped by 1/3, just have an exit capacity. Whatever the cost of your financing is doesn't really matter. You have to address these problems differently. And I would think, looking at that economy, that most of the problems now are of structural nature rather than of cyclical. Of course, part of it is cyclical, and it will be helped by our process of easing the rate.
3 requests here, one up there, then Bill White, and then over here. I'm conscious that there is, to my observation, relatively fewer women in the room than men, but men, you will have some female questions. So there is one to one line. Please.
Thank you, David Robbins from Market News. Do you think it's almost inevitable that central banks are laggards, are behind the curve in forecasting inflation risk arising from political events? I asked to give 2 examples, recent ones. The Bank of England in August conditioned its forecast on the previous government's, Conservative government's, fiscal arithmetic, because it always says it takes fiscal policy as given. In November, despite going down the Bernanke route, there was no Trump scenario. If you look at the work being done by private sector economists, everybody is doing Trump inflation risks. Largely from central banks so far, we've had, we'll see what happens, we'll see what happens in the market curves, etc. Isn't there a risk here that because of this political sensitivity, central banks just follow behind everyone else in forecasting inflation risks from politics?
Bring the microphone down here, please. We have a very distinguished guest here, Bill.
Megan, your three states of nature. Two of them involve inflationary pressures and probably higher real interest rates, higher for longer. And one thing that you haven't mentioned is the fact that the advanced market economies, and certainly many, many emerging market economies, are now laboring under levels of debt that are absolutely unprecedented. And I guess my question to the two of you is, we face, it seems to me, two separate sources of danger, and I'd like your assessment of how great those dangers are. One of them is, what are the implications for private sector debt and financial stability arising from higher for longer? I think the outcome is likely to be deflation. But the second concern, and we're seeing this now in US treasuries, think about the trust moment, all that kind of stuff, we also have real problems on the fiscal side, which is the public debt overhang. And the danger associated with that, with higher real interest rates, is the kind of Sergeant Wallace program, you know, of dynamic increases in debt service, gradually leading to more and more inflation. So on the one hand, the dangers of private sector debt overhang and deflation, and the dangers of public sector overhang and inflation. What should we worry about?
Thanks, Bill, for reminding us that financial stability is also part of the mandate of the central banking arena.
Thank you both. John Chong here from Investors Edge. I've just got two very quickly. Megan, in your last speech in September, you mentioned your preference in taking a more gradual approach to rate cuts. And obviously you cited the output gap gradually opening up over 25 and how it's necessary to bring inflation down. But since then, GDP has weakened quite substantially compared to H1 and quicker than anticipated as well. And even in the bank's latest estimates from the monetary policy report, the supply-demand deficit has actually loosened up in 2025 from 1.25 to 0.25. So does that change your thinking surrounding, you know, maybe you wouldn't have to wait as long because that output gap, you know, could start to prop up a little bit more? Or do you think this is more of a, you know, pre-post budget sort of blip? And just a second one real quick. I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that food inflation tends to have quite an impact on inflation expectations and then thereby wage expectations. If you look at, you know, grocery price inflation, it's been ticking up for the past 3 months, 4 months actually, as per Kantar. And, you know, on that basis, combined with your DMP report, seeing wage ahead, year-ahead expectations for wage growth at 4%, do you see, you know, upside risk in that going into 25 and, you know, the resurgence of not just food inflation, but stickier services inflation that hasn't yet been accounted for?
So I'd like to start with central bankers. Are they lagging? They're behind the curve.
Well, I think that the geopolitical risks are really difficult to model, to put in our models. In a way, you know, we have a scenario analysis. And it's not that we don't think about the possible repercussions of the different political outcomes. Let's say fragmentation first. And we do that. We try to model that, but then in our core model, which we use for forecasting, it's a matter of, you can only do it through the scenario analysis. If you're a hedge fund, you have to bet your money. If you're a central bank, you have the luxury of to wait and see, and then decide on the basis. That's what we say we're doing. On the basis of the incoming data, we decide what we're gonna do next. Good enough.
Yeah, but maybe you also start with Bill's question.
The bills, yeah, I've definitely seen more risk coming from the public debt overhang. And I had exactly that conversation and discussion this afternoon on the dynamics of course, there are different countries. So if I look at the Eurozone, if I look at my part of the Europe, like Central East Europe, public debt is low. But if you think about some other countries, of which I think you do think, and if you look at the risk of higher interest rates for longer, for various reasons that have been mentioned, and if you look at the average maturity, rollover risks, I mean, that's the risk. Now, is it appreciated enough? I don't think so. Neither probably by the politicians nor by the markets. But yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Megan, do you want to say anything about financial stability dimension, or go straight on to the third question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say briefly that in our latest financial stability reports, we're not raising massive red flags on any part of the financial services complex. So I would agree that actually it's the public sector debt overhang that's probably a bigger concern for now. Okay, our central bank's laggards in forecasting political risk. So as you rightly point out, we, in our forecasting process, we include what's been legislated rather than speculating on what's coming. And I think that is a cost worth paying for central bank independence, which I think is really important. You note that we didn't include a scenario on Trump tariffs in our November NPR, but that doesn't mean we didn't discuss what might happen, potential spillovers for the UK economy. So I guess I would highlight that too, which we mentioned in our minutes. If you look, we talk about trade fragmentation, for example. In terms of the, so you highlighted that GDP is weakened. It has, we expected it to, for what it's worth. According to a bunch, sort of our own indicators for underlying GDP growth, we've had it lower than what we saw in the first half of the year. So that hasn't really come as much of a surprise that it's weakened. Indeed, we expected it to. The output gap has changed. And that is partly because of the effects of the budget. So you know, a bigger negative output gap might have opened up without some of the measures in the budget, which accounts for part of the difference in our forecast. So is that a bit of a blip? Potentially. Also, you know, we provided a forecast, but we had lots of discussions about these different cases, right? And I think I'm in more of a case where I think we really do need an output gap to open up to bring inflation to target. Food inflation does impact inflation expectations. And, you know, we certainly look at that. For me, I'll take probably a bigger signal from the DMP survey on year ahead wages, just because they have gotten stuck at 4% for a couple of years. Do I think there's an upside risk to that? I think the risk really is that wages will end up being closer to 4% next year. So our agents tell us, for example, that in kind of preliminary discussions with firms, they're hearing that wage growth will probably come in somewhere between 2 and 4%. I think the risk is that it's closer to 4 than 2.
Okay. Lara, I'm going to give you the opportunity to let our online audience come in first, and then if there's a little bit of time left, I'll come back to you.
1 or 2?
You're up to 3.
Okay. Edward from Newcastle asks, what factors will affect the euro area and UK differently?
That's a very short answer.
Colin S., visitor to LSE, asks, especially in developing countries, how would the impacts of deglobalization affect the development of manufacturing industries and export-led growth? And to what extent could it have disinflationary effects?
Okay, Rebecca, question for you in this round. See if I attempt to get women to ask questions about success.
So I'm Ethan from Wilson Schools. So I had a question about specifically the differences between the ECB and England. So does the joint effort of the ECB to target the Eurozone as a whole leave like certain regions weaker in a weaker state than they would be with a national central bank? So I think everybody on the panel has sort of alluded to the fact there's like different structural issues within the Eurozone. So Boris, you brought up the idea of like Germany and the industrial sector, but if the Eurozone is home to like vastly different economies, so doesn't it follow that each should have their own national bank or like specific regional central banks? Or does this just lead to further fragmentation and then further inflation?
Shortly before you were born, they did the opposite. Okay, that's 3 questions. So, Boris, would you like to start?
Yeah, okay, let me start from the last question then. Well, whether it makes, if I understood, more sense to have a common central bank or the national central banks would make, well, that's a long discussion that has been going on, and I thought it's settled by now, and I would think that everybody, at least who sits with me in the room, and the Governing Council agrees that it's better to have the one central bank than to have national central banks. And I think that the Eurozone so far has proved that it's good for everyone. Nobody ever wants to leave the Eurozone. And I think that people who vote with their feet, if they would not like it, if they would think it's not good, they would have left. Nobody thought about it.
Can I just throw in there that you might pose the same question about California or Wales? They don't seem to agitate in favor of separate currencies.
Yeah. Deglobalization. How does it affect the advanced economies, manufacturing sector there, or whether it works deflationary? Actually, as I guess I said, I think that the deglobalization mainly has inflationary effects. It's a fragmentation, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and they all, in a way, either increase the prices, and people discuss whether it's a level increase, or there is a kind of a dynamic story behind it. It all depends whether you have only one increase in tariffs or you have a repeated gain, but other side is responding. How does it, for example, the wage setting mechanism, labor market in different places, which can be then dynamic, not a level price shift, etc. But overall, except for, as I said, decrease in the external demand for domestic goods and services, all other things that I can think are more inflationary rather than deflationary. And then what factors would affect? Well, that's a very difficult question. I don't know what factors would affect EMU and UK differently. Was that the question?
Yeah.
Where do I start? Think about that question. It's just so broad. Well, I'll leave it to Megan to start with that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess one way to segue from our presentations to that question is looking at R-star. So if you look at market-based measures of R-star in the Eurozone, they're somewhere around 2%. And if you look at market-based measures of R-star in the UK, they're somewhere between 3.25% to 3.5%. So that suggests there's kind of a fundamental structural difference between the Eurozone and the UK. So that's a good place to start.
Which I think is tantamount to saying the UK is more inflation prone. Because you need a higher interest rate to curb it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think R-star shifted, and you'll know more about this than I do, but over the course of the Euro crisis, I think that's a big piece of how the Eurozones ended up much lower than the UK's. So that's one broad answer. In terms of having a central bank for the country or a bunch of different central banks, it's just worth pointing out. I mentioned the agents who tell us about wage growth. So the Bank of England has split the UK up into 12 different agencies, we call them, and we have agents in every one of them who are constantly talking to businesses and getting kind of on the ground intel for us. And actually, they're not just talking to businesses, they're talking to the third sector, so charities, things like that as well. And so they feed back intelligence to us, but also we all go on agency visits. I'm going to Northern Ireland in 2 weeks, I think, to talk to a bunch of different actors. And it's a really useful way to get kind of canaries in the coal mine, I guess, around inflection points. All our data is pretty backwards looking. So when you are close to an inflection point, it's useful to hear from people on the ground and how they're actually experiencing it all. So I'm in favor, obviously, of having one central bank for the UK, but it is important to gather intelligence from all parts of the UK. On the development of manufacturing with the deglobalization, I would agree that also tends to be inflationary, but I guess I might just highlight a different point, which is from the US's experience, where off the back of the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and the infrastructure bill, there has been an increase in manufacturing jobs in the US, much to my surprise. I was a massive skeptic that would ever happen, but it has been notable. And I guess I'll just mention it because manufacturing jobs tend to be high wage jobs in the grand scheme of things. So it does help create some of the jobs that you want to be creating.
I regret to say we're out of time, and much as it would be great to go on for another hour, I'm afraid we just have to stop for various reasons. To me, it's been stimulating and excellent discussion. I don't think it's possible to sum up what we've decided or what we've been told during this session, other than that inflation is still there. We know a lot about inflation that we didn't know before, but we don't yet know what the inflation beast is going to shape into the next time it re-emerges. For those of you with longer memories or older parents, you will know that inflation was a huge phenomenon in the 1970s and 1980s, and then it seemed to disappear for the best part of 30 years. So it was quite a shock when it resurfaced in 2021. We don't yet know whether it's going to come back again in a form that is going to be require yet different policy. So I hope you will join me in thanking Laura, who helped put this together, on behalf of the European Institute, David March from 1/5 and his colleagues who helped in other respects, and above all, our two speakers, Boris Vujčić and Megan Greene. So please give them the honor.